What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking, and today I am finally going to be talking about one of the biggest metal bands of all time. Some might say the band that saved metal in the 90s, and that is Texas metal legends, Pantera. I'm wearing the shirt for a reason today. So yeah, this was one I was always wanting to do, but I just never thought about doing it until I decided, you know what? Since we already got 4 rankings confirmed for 2024 that I'm doing, why not throw in 2 more surprises that I chose that were completely different? Because I wanted to do some more variety with the discography rankings this year, and Pantera was one I thought of. You know what? Why don't we go ahead and get through this? And here we are with the Pantera ranking itself. So as far as how I got in the Pantera, kind of a hodgepodge of quite a few things. First, it was ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, when they used to have actual music from bands as theme songs for the wrestlers. Rob Van Dam would come out to the song Walk, which was awesome, and I fell in love with the song immediately at that time. But as far as my love for Pantera, didn't really grow until about mid to late 2000s, whenever Guitar Hero was becoming a big phenomenon for video games and music games and such, and I first heard of Cowboys from Hell courtesy of the first Guitar Hero, and then I checked out the actual song, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And lo and behold, I've become a fan of theirs ever since. Of course, I'm mainly talking about everything from Cowboys from Hell on through to the end. Didn't know about the glam stuff that they did back in the 80s, so yeah, I am talking about those albums too. I'm not leaving them out, so yeah, we're going to be in for, excuse me, we're going to be in for some interesting stuff here. So without further ado, why don't we get into the history of Pantera? So the origins of Pantera go back to 1981, where 2 brothers, Daryl and Vinnie Paul Abbott, were already becoming players on their instruments respectively ever since they were kids. Like, even their father, Jerry Abbott, was such a huge supporter of his kids becoming musicians since he loved music himself. And even told Dime when he was, I believe, like 10, 11 years old, if you're going to play an instrument, you're going to play a real instrument, and that's guitar. Even though at first Dime turned it down in favor of a damn bike, eventually he got a Gibson Les Paul guitar and fell in love with it and would just hold it for a while until Vinny told him, are you actually going to play the damn thing? And he started to play it and eventually became a guitar legend, and we all know that. And then Vinnie Paul, on the other hand, playing drums and would eventually become an accomplished drummer himself. So, 1981 comes around, they decided to form their own band. Originally, they were going to go with a couple of different names, Eternity and eventually Gemini, but then they settled on Pantera after a friend of Vinny's from school told him about the Pantera sports car, but also was Spanish for panther, and they thought it sounded really cool. So, Pantera was born in 1981 out of Arlington, Texas. The original lineup consisted of course, Dime on guitar, Vinny on drums. We would have Terry Glaze coming in on second guitars, and then eventually vocals, vocalist Donnie Hart, and bassist Tommy Bradford. Although this lineup was very short-lived, as at the beginning of 1982, both Donnie and Tommy would leave, leaving only Terry, Vinny, and Dime left to salvage everything. And then when it came down to it, Terry decided, you know what, I'm just going to be the vocalist, I ain't going to play guitar, because I can't play as good as you can, Daryl, so, yeah, just vocals for me. And then when it came down to who would take over on bass, old friend of Vinny's from school, one Rex Brown, as they were both in the same classes together back in the day. And, well, Vinny was at first kind of apprehensive because Rex was the bad dude. He smoked and drank all the time. So Vinny's like, you can join the band, but during practice, don't smoke or drink. He shows up to practice with a pack of smokes and a pack of beer, and Vinny's like, oh my god, what have we got ourselves into with this shit? But they eventually all hit it off, and they gelled pretty well. I'll give them that back in the day. So that's where we ended up with the original quote-unquote Pantera lineup that wasn't with Tommy and Donnie. You get the idea. But they would actually go to their father Jerry to do some production work because they were just playing local places, doing covers, and then they started to write their own music and also would form their own label, Metal Magic Records, which Jerry gave them that name because he thought these kids have metal magic within. So, Metal Magic Records is born, and Jerry would step up as producer because they would go to the studio to work on their debut album, and then released June 10th of 1983, we get Metal Magic. Now, Metal Magic, it's my last place. It's number 9. I knew it would be going into this because, yeah, very humble beginnings for these guys. After all, this was the beginning of their career, and they were very much a glam metal band at this point. Like, especially on this album, it's very, very glam metal sounding. Like, lots of nods to Kiss, maybe some Judas Priest, but there's also a lot of Van Halen worship, as we all know these three bands would act as main pillars to their sound, at least early on. And yeah, basically the notes I wrote for this: cheesy as fuck lyrics, below average vocals, although the guitar work, when it came down to riffs and leads, was pretty musically sound. After all, Dime at this point, he was only 16, 17 years old, and he was writing some nice riffs, but already showcasing his prowess in his guitar solos. Production's decent. Jerry did a solid job. For 1983, it's not a bad recording, although the big thing that shines on this album is Rex on bass. Like, his bass parts pretty much shine throughout the entire album. Like, the one thing that kind of kept me in this album was Rex's bass. Like, it's audible in the mix, and it's solid, and even some of the riffs that Daryl came up with, and especially the solos, were cool. But God, the lyrics and the vocals. Like, Terry Glaze to me sounded like if Joe Elliott from Def Leppard never went through puberty. That's the best way I could describe it. But yeah, as far as like some of the notes, there's Biggest Part of Me, which was a ballad, which they wanted that to be a big hit, and it does sound like a ripoff of Def Leppard. Also, the synths in there were a bit much. Sad Lover almost sounds like what could have been a Danzig song, but just not as good. But as far as any standout songs I did like, I liked I'll Be Alright because it has some classic heavy metal nods to like early Iron Maiden and Judas Priest. The title track Metal Magic was really cool, although it definitely felt like they were mixing Judas Priest Exciter and Motley Crue Livewire and mixing those two songs together, and you get the song Metal Magic. And then Rock Out's actually a pretty good song, though it sounds like, the way I describe it, it sounds like the heaviest Foghat song that was never written. So yeah, the vocals kind of killed this album for me. If they would have had somebody better, I probably would like this album more, but the vocals just absolutely killed it for me. So, but again, some cool riffs, damn good leads, and the bass work is really cool because it's really present in the mix. And for young kids, it wasn't terrible in terms of music. It's just, this isn't what you would think of with Pantera. I'll just leave it at that. But anyways, on the heels of Metal Magic, they would keep getting around, playing the local circuit, and then in 1984 would go back to the studio, once again Jerry Abbott producing, and we would get Projects in the Jungle. Projects in the Jungle I have as my number 8. It was a vast improvement musically over Metal Magic because I almost would think this sounds like a different band because musically and production got better and the musicianship got even tighter. And it's a heavier album. Like, the guitar tones are much heavier, kind of like a precursor to what they would become later on in the 80s when it comes down to tone. But yeah, there's more shred going on when it comes to the guitars. The production has, like I said, more crunch to it. Although the vocals this time around sounded even more over the top than they were on Metal Magic. And as far as notable moments, like the song Like Fire almost kind of gave me Turbo era Judas Priest vibes. Like, it almost has that kind of sensibility, and yet this was 2 years before Turbo came out, so maybe Priest was listening to this album when they made Turbo? I don't know. That's maybe a thought. I don't know. Strong bass line on In Over My Head, despite a more Def Leppard vibes. Although some nice acoustic work on Only a Heartbeat Away, but nothing really much else to it. But as far as like standout songs, Out for Blood kind of starting to bring in some speed and, dare I say, even a little bit of early thrash to their sound. And it sounds like the band Exciter to me. Blue Light Turning Red, this was a big surprise because this was like Pantera's equivalent to Van Halen's Eruption. It's this big solo instrumental and Daryl just tearing up the lead and even putting in some nice nasty harmonies on top. The title track, Projects in the Jungle, was really cool, really awesome speed metal Galloping Fury. The song Killers, which was the closing track, I believe, more speed metal goodness. So yeah, they were definitely getting a little bit heavier and a little more speedy with this album. And then even the song Heavy Metal Rules, while it's generic, it's catchy. I actually like that song, I'm not gonna lie. So, yeah. While you could say this is a far better version of Metal Magic due to a heavier guitar tone and more crunch to the production and some more songwriting variety, again, Terry, no. Just no. I can't do it. But it lands as my number 8. So again, more playing the local circuit and kind of still just being the fun band that everybody in the area wanted to go see to have a good time. They would go back to the studio once again, Jerry Abbott producing, and released in 1985, we get I Am the Night. This one, my number 7. We're moving up. We're moving up. And again, this is, another one of those cases where production and musicianship just keep getting better. Like, well, the production does have some misfires. Like, it sounds more gritty, which is really cool. The bass drum sounds better than it did on Projects in the Jungle, but the snare sounds a little bit weaker, which kind of strange. But you do get some more thrash metal influences coming in at this point, and even musically kind of feels like, the best way to describe it, and just like Shred Lord of Thralls of Metal said, and I completely agree, sounds like they were one to write the best B-sides to Judas Priest Screaming for Vengeance. Although again, the vocals, I feel like the vocals got worse. Like, I think Metal Magic was probably Terry's best album-wise vocal performance, but that ain't really saying much because he just got worse over the next 2 albums. The vocals suck on this album, but musically it got better, although I will say the lyrics on Hot and Heavy, what? And the vocals. And then even the song DGTTM, completely pointless. But as far as standouts, the song I Am the Night is another great track so far in this era with more of that speed metal grit to it. Onward We Rock kind of feels like, again, an early Iron Maiden song with a galloping bass line, almost like Rex was channeling Steve Harris a little bit at this point. Ride on the Edge, maybe the best glam song they wrote, and the vocals aren't terrible, and the acoustic parts were very tasty. And then Valhalla, more of that like Judas Priest speed metal nastiness to it, but the big standout, Down Below, which, yeah, it definitely kind of reminds me of Overkill, and this was a big like thrash metal song, so yeah, you could definitely tell they were switching up musical direction by this point, but Terry just wasn't quite getting it, and yeah, stuff happens, I suppose, but still, again, getting heavier and tighter, even though the lyrics are probably the dumbest lyrics yet across the whole discography. But again, the musical improvement going on within these guys was just, and that's why it went up to my number 7. So, after I Am the Night, it was pretty much around the time of writing I Am the Night in 1985, and then eventually in 1986, They were mainly Dime, Vinny, and Rex. They were really starting to get into more of the underground stuff that was coming up at the time. So they were really getting into bands like Venom, Possessed, Slayer, and Metallica especially, and decide, you know what, we need to go more that direction, that more extreme thrash metal direction, but still retain some of the classic heavy metal influences we have, but kind of mesh it together with what's coming up right now because we gotta really stay ahead of the game here. And, well, because they wanted to go that direction, Terry Glaze couldn't hang and would be fired in 1986. Then, for the next several months, they would toy around with a bunch of different singers, including one guy who was a big fan of the band and decided to hang out and be like, hey, can I sing for you guys at the show? And they're like, okay, let's see what you got. And apparently did a fantastic job, and they were like, you know what? Come for the show tomorrow and we'll see if you get the job. And the guy was so excited, he went on a 24-hour bender, didn't sleep. He was so excited, then within 5 minutes he collapsed and was taken to the hospital at the show. So, pretty legendary one-show run for unknown singer. But then 1987 comes around. They decide to take a trip over to New Orleans because they want to see possible scouts for a new singer. And there was this band out of New Orleans who wanted to give their singer a shot with Pantera, and that same band, Razor White, would tell their man, one Philip H. Anselmo, that, hey, maybe you should hook up with these guys from Texas. They're a fucking killer. And a friendship blossomed between Phil and the rest of the Pantera guys, and in 1987, Philip H. Anselmo joins Pantera, and the rest is history with that, and this would be the lineup for the rest of their career. So, because they got Phil, who, at this point, was showing his vocal ability, like, very much like a grittier, sleazier version of Rob Halford at this point. Like, he can hit the big high notes and dynamic vocal range. Like, he could sing low, he could sing high, he could do it all. And they loved it, which inspired them to get even more into the heavier, slightly more extreme sound. So they would go back to the studio at the end of 1987 into 1988. This time, Mark Ferrari from Keel would do the production, while Jerry Abbott would help out here and there. And released in May of 1988, their final album on Metal Magic Records, we get Power Metal. This is actually my number 5. I actually think this is a fantastic album, and I would say easily the most underrated album of their entire career, because this isn't what people would think of when they think of Pantera. But again, production gets better, the music gets heavier, even tighter, grittier, and a lot more rougher around the edges in a good way. And of course, Phil's vocals are some of the best vocals he ever delivered was on this album. And of course, the shred that Dime is unleashing continues to evolve and get better, as well as the musicianship. Musically, a lot less glam metal, and definitely more towards classic heavy metal, speed metal, and thrash metal. As I can definitely hear, as far as like the classic metal vibes, I can definitely hear where fellow Texas band Eternal Champion kind of gets a little bit of their vibes from off of this album. But yeah, like pretty much top to bottom, this album's fantastic. Like, Rock the World's a fun opener, but the main standouts, the title track, reminded me a lot of Annihilator, like that kind of clean, thrashy speed metal type sound. We'll Meet Again felt like a precursor to a song I'll be talking about on the next album. Over and Out, great triplet gallops, but still thrashy to the bone. Down Below, they would actually redo that song from I Am the Night on here, and it's far better on here because, well, Phil can sing in key and sing his balls off. Death Trap, another heavy, crunchy, thrashy tune, almost more like Metal Church to some degree. And then Burn, thrashy barn burner again with more Annihilator, but also some of that like Armored Saint classic heavy metal nods in there too. And then the song Pussy Tight. While dumb lyrics, musically it's heavy, and Dime's on vocals for this song and does a pretty solid job, makes it sound more tough when they're talking about wanting to fuck pussy. So, yeah. Overall, this is a fantastic album, and like I said, the most underrated one in their catalog, simply for the fact this isn't what a lot of people think of with Pantera. And then what's funny, they were originally going to be on Gold Mountain Records for this album. Like, they sent their early demos for this album. And Gold Mountain thought they were getting another Bon Jovi, but they heard this one and they were like, nah, you can have it. Because, yeah, image-wise, still lots of Hairspray and Aquanet at that point, but musically doesn't even sound remotely close to that. And with that said, my number 5. So, over the next year or so, they would continue playing the local gigs, and sometime in 1989, they were playing at a fan's birthday party. Which, could you imagine having a band like that play for your birthday? I know I would love something like that. But that will never happen. But I digress. So they were playing this birthday party, and word got out in the area that Adco executive Mark Ross was in the area due to Hurricane Hugo, I believe was what it was. Because he was going to go see another band, but because he was stuck in Texas, he called his boss and was like, well, what do I do while I'm here? And they're like, check out the band Pantera, see what they're up to. And he went and saw Pantera, and according to Mark, the first thing he saw was everybody just circle headbanging the whole time, like Phil in particular, and it just got wild. And he heard them play, and within like one or two songs, he went outside, and then the guys in the band thought he just left the show altogether and wasn't coming back, so they decided to just go on their party and just drink and just go absolutely hammered crazy. And then after the show was over, Mark comes back and they're like, we thought you left. What gives? And Mark's like, no, I went outside to go make a phone call to my boss. You guys, if you're interested, are going to be signed to Adco Records, because according to Mark himself, he said, how could you not see these guys? How can you see these guys and not think, holy shit? Because they were blowing minds at this point. So, Pantera signs to Adco Records, a major label, and I believe, if I remember right, a subsidiary of Atlantic Records. And pretty much right as they got that deal, everybody decided, you know what? The glam stuff isn't for us anymore. Glam doesn't play music, we play music. And Vinny was at first kind of reluctant to do it, but then he went along with it, and then they just looked more like themselves. T-shirts, jeans, shirts, and all sorts of shit. And not wearing the hairspray or dyeing their hair anymore, so thankfully that was the case, because it made them look tougher. But then we get into the beginning of 1990, they entered the studio, and they would actually have Terry Date come in as the producer, because the band really liked what Terry did with Soundgarden, but most especially with Overkill on The Years of Decay, as even Dime will say that Bobby Gustafson's guitar work and guitar tone on The Years of Decay would act as a huge inspiration for Dime for the rest of his career, and why they would go with Terry Date. So Terry Date comes in, great choice of producer going forward for the most part, and going in the studio, hammering out some killer songs, and then finally released their major label debut, July 24th, 1990. We get Cowboys from Hell. Going into this ranking, this was my number 1. Coming out of it, still my number 1. There will never be a Pantera album that will eclipse this, in my personal opinion. This album is a masterpiece. One of my all-time favorite metal albums to go and check out from time to time. Most especially for the opening title track, which is my favorite Pantera song of all time. And this album definitely represents big change. While Phil's vocals still were soaring, you start to get little increments of the Phil Anselmo we would come to know for the rest of the career, but still retaining what he was doing on power metal. The guitar and bass tones get heavier and more nasty, more extreme. And of course, even Vinny's drums just get even better, and the drum tones themselves sound huge. So yeah, Terry Date definitely did a fantastic job when it came to the production and the mix. And this album, it's just downright fun and catchy and heavy and pummeling. Like, I could go off and name off every song, but I'll name all my favorite standouts. Of course, the title track, thrashy, but still with some nice swing to it, with an amazing lead. Like, hell, I'll say when it comes to riffs and leads, this might as well be the pinnacle of Dimebag, and yet still relatively unknown at this point. Nobody really heard of him until this album, and he was 23, 24 years old. But then Psycho Holiday, catchy grooves and triplet swings that are killer. Even Primal Concrete Sledge, under 2 minutes, but it is a brutal 2 minutes. Cemetery Gates, I brought up in Power Metal how the song We'll Meet Again was kind of like a precursor. It was a precursor to this song. And I would say maybe their best balladish track, but there's some incredible vocals, those massive high notes at the end that Phil nails, as well as the whammy with Dime's guitar and the solos. Domination, it's thrash Pantera done perfectly with arguably the greatest breakdown in the history of breakdowns. Heresy, that song feels like Metallica, and I absolutely love it for that reason. Shattered, it's more thrashy goodness with mostly high vocals throughout. Medicine Man, great tribal grooves and beats with catchy riffs. But then the final two songs, The Sleep and the Art of Shredding, two underrated cuts, especially The Sleep. It's artistic with great texture, melody, gorgeous leads. And then The Art of Shredding is exactly that. It's a thrashy barn burner with a great breakdown. I mean, what more can I say about this album that hasn't been said already? It's a masterpiece. Easily top 5, if not top 10 metal albums of 1990. Amazing. Number 1. So, moving on from Cowboys from Hell, they finally get to do a proper tour as they got to open for Suicidal Tendencies and Exodus for this run on Cowboys from Hell, and lots of crazy stuff happening, but getting exposed to a bigger audience. More of the thrash kids really got into these guys and just really latched on to them. They would go back to the studio in 1991 to work on their next album, and released February 25th, 1992, we get Vulgar Display of Power. This one ended up falling to my number 4. This album, still fantastic. Definitely another big sound evolution. Like, it's less of the thrash and definitely more towards groove metal. Like, maybe they were listening to Exorder at this point. Yeah, there's always going to be that debate about Pantera and Exorder. I'm not going to get into it too much because why hate on either band? They both are great. So get over it. But yeah, this was definitely their first proper groove metal album. Like, you definitely heard groove metal on Cowboys from Hell, but it was still more on the thrash end of the scale. This was definitely less thrashy and more towards groove metal. Little bits of hardcore at times. But the guitar tones get even heavier and crunchier, and they tune down to C sharp. And even Phil's vocals change as it's got more rougher tones, and even at times bordering on death metal in terms of the aggression. And lyrically, definitely changing up to more of that tough guy imagery and somewhat more socio-political commentary, while Dime still shreds his ass off. But standout tracks, Mouth for War, chuggy monster, but with some hardcore D-beats thrown into the mix. Of course, Walk, one of the most recognizable riffs of all time. It's fun, catchy grooves. Fucking Hostile. You could argue it's like a crossover thrash song, but it's arguably one of the most brutal crossover thrash songs. It's just hostile, as the title implies. And then you get to songs like This Love, which is another one of them balladish tracks, but it's like a spiteful, angry breakup song with mood and aggression and a killer breakdown. At the end, that was almost doomy. The song Rise kind of feels like a continuation of Cowboys from Hell. It has more of that thrash metal, visceral aggression latched onto it. By Demons Be Driven, Chugathon riffs with some nice bends. And then the closing track, Hollow, one of the best melodic Pantera songs from this era, but still some great heavy riffs with one of the best grooves at the end. But some of the acoustic work on this track, I can maybe kind of hear where Opeth got some inspiration from. Not all, but just a little peppering of it I kind of hear on Hollow. So I can kind of hear where Opeth might have gotten a bit of that influence from. But still, even though it's my number 4, it fell a couple spots. It's still a fantastic album. Nothing more, nothing less. So now, moving on, they continue to start playing bigger tours, playing in Europe and all sorts of places you never thought they would go to. And pretty much by this point, the landscape of music was changing, with grunge becoming the flavor of the month, Metallica changing direction to more straight-up heavy metal, and then eventually what they would do later in the 90s. And the press tried to say metal was dead by the time 1994 rolled around, but that is such a hyperbole, because metal was still thriving in the 90s. It just went back to the underground. Because, I mean, look at what happened in the 90s, and that could be a whole other video for another time. But Pantera pretty much saw what happened when Metallica changed direction. They thought, you know what, we'll change direction too, but we're going to be heavier than what we were on Vulgar. And they would go back to Terry Date and released March 22nd, 1994, we get Far Beyond Driven. This is my number 3. This is even heavier, more brutal, and of course, went to number 1 on the Billboard Top 200, which easily it's the heaviest album to reach number 1 on Billboard. It is, and it's an amazing feat, despite not a whole lot of radio or MTV play at this point, maybe on Headbangers Ball, but went to number 1 because Pantera fans were waiting for this to come out. But yeah, definitely, again, less thrash coming in, more towards the straight-up groove metal sound. But when it comes down to it, you still get ripping leads from Dime, but he does experiment with certain tones, like the lead in Strength Beyond Strength, which, by the way, that's a thrashy tune, but with a doomy breakdown of brutality. But you could tell Dime was experimenting with tones for his leads on that song. But yeah, some things, I will admit, like Phil's vocals, even more aggressive this time around. Great breakdowns, but then, of course, odd lyrics, I would say, in Good Friends and a Bottle of Pills. Kind of strange there. But as far as standout songs, of course, I already talked about Strength Beyond Strength. Even the 2 singles, 5 Minutes Alone and I'm Broken, while they're singles, they're still brutal and heavy and catchy. 5 Minutes Alone, chug-a-thon with catchy melodies and bends. I'm Broken's just brutal, but with some off-time rhythms. Slaughtered, thrashy and chuggy, feels like a callback to Vulgar a little bit, with some nasty double-time rhythms, but no solo. It was the first time, I think, as far as a full song goes, no solo. And he was trying to figure it out, but he thought, you know what, let's just keep the riffs going. 25 years, strong Black Sabbath vibes, I will admit, with a thrashy bridge to it. Use My Third Arm, almost death metal in the riffs and then the drums. Throes of Rejection, catchy all throughout. Hardline Sunken Cheeks, probably the most evil and sinister Pantera song of all time. And even Doomy and Nasty Gallops, and even the closer, their cover of Planet Caravan, one of the greatest cover songs of all time, I would say. But yeah, Far Beyond Driven, my number 3. So, even around the time Far Beyond Driven was being made, Phil was starting to distance himself from the rest of the band due to an ongoing back issue that he was dealing with that bothered him for many years. But he would go on to do side projects, had Down going by this point, and Dime was always supportive of Phil spreading his wings a little bit. But they would return to the studio at the beginning of 1996, and they would decide to not go to a professional studio anymore, and pretty much said, you know what, let's just bring the studio to our house. And Terry Dade coming back to Texas to record. Although Phil would record his vocals from New Orleans and send the tapes over because he was starting to, like I said, distance himself. But what we would get is quite a dark album. Released on May 7th, 1996, we get The Great Southern Trendkill. This is my number 2. I didn't really listen to a whole lot of this album until doing this ranking, and I heard the whole thing. Holy shit, easily the heaviest, most aggressive, and brutal album of Pantera's entire career. And yeah, and it's a little bit disjointed because, like I said, they didn't record together. Like Phil recorded his stuff elsewhere while Dime, Vinny, and Rex did their stuff at their home studio. Although, when it comes to leads, some of Dime's best lead work post Cowboys comes up here. Like I said, it's their darkest album yet. The lyrics are angry and dark, and even some guest screaming vocals from one Seth Putnam. And I'm not going to mention him any further. As far as standout tracks, the title track, it's thrashy, but again, bordering on death metal at times. War Nerve, off-time rhythms with that just chug hard, and even some triplet chugs kind of coming in to just really pound you up the head. Drag the Waters, groovy as all get out. 13 Steps to Nowhere. This is one of those songs where you get some of that more personal and more social commentary from Phil. But the song itself, tribal grooves and beats with some catchy, vicious riffs. Living Through Me, Hell's Wrath, punky fury, but with like a nice doomy break. And then, of course, you get, songs like Tens and Floods and Suicide Note Part 1, where you get some more subdued atmosphere. Like Tens, it's sullen and dark with Black Sabbath feels, gorgeous solo. Suicide Note Part 1, somber acoustic piece, but then it leads into the sheer hostility of Suicide Note Part 2, where it's just brutal and vicious and gnarly sounding. But of course, Floods, probably the doomiest song that they ever made, and probably the best solo Dime ever delivered. It's a powerful tune. It's fucking all about, like, praying that the floods would end mankind to start the planet anew. And it definitely fits that atmosphere. Like, it's doomy, but with some, like, heavy as fuck riffs in, like, the big breakdown, especially the snare hits. Like, especially if you saw this live and the pyro goes off during them snare hits. Ooh, it's just... Yeah, and I think because of the disjointed nature of this album is why this album maybe gets propelled a little bit, because it represents more anger and more brutality within the songwriting. So, yeah, Great Southern Trendkill, my number 2. It could surpass Cowboys, but I don't see it surpassing Cowboys. I think these are going to be the 2 forever Pantera albums for me. Yeah, it's killer. But now, after Great Southern Trendkill, then some more tension and stuff started mounting. Hell, not long later in '96, Phil almost died of a heroin overdose and began his addiction to heroin and drugs to deal with his back and further distancing himself from everybody else. And while they would tour, even doing some Ozfests here and there and some big shows, however, they didn't get back to the studio for a long time until 1999, and basically they did as sort of a love letter to the fans who wanted to hear new music from Pantera. And released March 14th of 2000, we get Reinventing the Steel. Yeah, this one fell to my number 6. Again, it's still a good album. I'll still go back and listen to it when I'm in the mood. But yeah, it definitely does sound like a band is falling apart at the seams. And no Terry date. This was actually produced by Dime and Vinny themselves. And while they did a good job, I'm glad I got the 20th anniversary edition with the Terry date mix, and it sounds killer. And while you still get some catchy riffs, and there's even some older ideas popping up on here, like as far back as even Power Metal and Cowboys from Hell, you get some of those vibes popping up here and there. Even lower guitar tunings, but it does feel like a diet version of themselves. And like songs like Will Grind That Axe for a Long Time feels like I'm Broken Part 2, but not as good. And like Uplift, You've Gotta Belong to It. They're okay songs, but as far as standouts, there were still plenty of standouts. Goddamn Electric with the triplet blues and thrashy riffs, even featuring one Kerry King of Slayer. Yesterday Don't Mean Shit. That was the song that kind of felt like a callback to Power Metal and Cowboys from Hell, but throwing in some Vulgar into it. Revolution is My Name, catchy chugs, but with some swing like Sabbath. It Makes Them Disappear. It's a heavy beast, but with atmosphere. And then I'll Cast a Shadow. It's pretty thrashy and chuggy, and I loved it. But really, for me, the best two songs from this time frame would be Avoid the Light and Immortally Insane. Like, Immortally Insane was like a sludge metal song, like almost like Crowbar, but it was really cool. And then Avoid the Light, it's more acoustic oriented, but with still some crunchy riffs and drums, and it was on the Dracula 2000 soundtrack. And these two were legit great songs. But yeah, the album, this time frame, yeah, you can definitely tell they were kind of on their way out, and like even Phil wasn't Phil at this point, like kind of losing his mind. And it all came to a head. But still, it's still a good album, but it's not going to be one that I would go to first if I'm in the mood for Pantera. If I am going to listen to it, I'll listen to the songs that I like off of it, which there's still about half of the album's good, and then the other half's just kind of so-so for me. But it's still a good album, but it falls to my number 6. And sadly, that would be the last Pantera album we would get. They would stay together for a couple of more years until finally hanging it up in 2003, and then Damage Plan formed out of the ashes from Dime and Vinny, and they did one album, which then unfortunately led to December of 2004 when we lost Dimebag Darrell in Columbus, just 2 hours north of me, shot and murdered. And still to this day, it's one of the saddest things to ever happen, and not just metal but music as a whole, because nobody was shot and murdered on stage. Like, the closest you ever had to something like that was John Lennon, but that was at his house, I believe. This was while Dime was performing, and it was just and it's still a big giant open wound. And then 2018, we lose Vinnie Paul, so both of the Abbott boys, sadly no longer with us, but are in a better place now, which is what the important thing of it is. And probably my brother Rue's up there, probably jamming tunes with him right now and watching him play. It does make me smile to know that, but yeah, so that pretty much ended Pantera for a long time, and of course tensions between Phil and Vinny didn't help matters either. However, 2022 comes around, and out of nowhere, we get the announcement there's going to be a Pantera reunion, but it's more of a tribute to the band as well as Dime and Vinny, and a celebration of the band's history. And of course, as far as the lineup, we get Zakk Wylde on guitars, who was the perfect choice. Charlie Benante of Anthrax, which is the perfect choice for drums, and of course, Phil and Rex. And of course, yeah, Phil's PR stuff over the years have not been the greatest, but I forgive him for all that shit because he seems to be a changed man, a lot happier now, and I want to see this. I am still waiting for this Pantera celebration tour to come to Columbus or Cincinnati. I will buy a ticket, and I will be there. No questions asked, because I want to hear these songs live. Now, of course, the big thing people gotten up in arms about is, oh, they're going to record under the Pantera name. That's not happening. Even Zakk said himself he would love to record with these guys, but under a different name, which makes total sense. And I wouldn't mind hearing an album with Phil, Rex, Zakk, and Charlie together. I think it'd sound pretty good. Just don't do it under the Pantera name. That's all we ask for. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for the Pantera album ranking. Of course, what is the legacy of Pantera? Well, if you take most of the glam albums out of the equation, particularly talk about from Cowboys through to the end, the legacy of the band that, to some people, saved metal in America during the 90s when grunge took over, eventually nu metal took over. Pantera was like the one band in terms of the mainstream that kind of kept the torch burning, even though metal was still doing great. It was mostly in the underground again because of so many other factors. And of course, the legacies of the musicians involved. Dime, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Vinnie Paul, a fantastic drummer. Even Rex Brown, very underrated bassist. And Phil Anselmo, amazing singer that can sing in all sorts of different ways. And with that, that ends Pantera's history right there. But of course, with these rankings, it's just my opinion, but how would you guys rank the Pantera discography? Let me know in the comments below. As far as the next ranking coming up, well, it won't happen till June, but I'm going to be talking about Exodus. And I know a lot of my friends who are thrash heads like me have been wanting me to do Exodus for a long time. It's just, there just been other thrash bands I like more, but I am a fan of Exodus, and I can't wait to go through all of their albums to do that ranking, but that'll be coming in June. But anyways, thanks for watching. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Keep your horns high and your dreams wet.